Welcome to Biology of Marine Mammals. I'm Dr. Leslie Williams, and this lecture introduces you to sensory physiology and how it applies to marine mammals. To get started, we'll first look at the sensory organs and how sense organs are necessary to help an individual perceive their environment. From there, we'll take a look at selected senses, including vision, touch, and smell. As a human, we rely on, let's say, 5 senses that basically help us to what's called perceive our environment. In other words, take some appreciation and knowledge of the world around us. This, of course, helps us make decisions. For example, if you're walking straight and you happen to walk into a table, you might say to yourself, gee, I really wish I had seen that table ahead of time so I didn't walk into it. In other words, as someone who uses their eyes for vision, that vision helps you perceive that there is a table in front of you, and therefore you should probably redirect your position so you don't hit the table. We rely more or less on 5 senses: vision, hearing, touch, taste, and smell. Obviously, some of these are going to be more important to us than others. So as a human, we rely extensively on vision and hearing, whereas something like smell and taste may not be that important. In other words, if you were to lose your sense of smell, it wouldn't seem as vital as losing your sense of vision. But that's not necessarily the same trend for all mammals. If you take your dog for a walk, for example, you know very well that smell is incredibly important to dogs. They're always smelling everything. So clearly, the proportion of senses that contribute to how a mammal perceives their environment is going to differ from mammal to mammal. And what we're going to try to get at today is basically looking at how marine mammals are going to be shaped by the fact that they have gone back into the water, their aqueous environment, and what that has done to their sensing of the environment. So, as a marine mammal that's moved into the marine environment, we have to remember that the properties of water are going to be very different than the properties of air. And so there's going to need to be some evolutionary forces that change how marine mammals sense their marine environment. And again, as a human, all it takes is swimming underwater to realize that your eyes are not adapted for perceiving vision underwater well. Things are very blurry underwater. Sounds very, very weird underwater. So clearly, our organs are designed to perceive the environment in air. But what about marine mammals? They need to perceive the marine environment. So what is it that they need to do in order to assess what's going on around them in this marine environment? And while different marine mammals do show some differences, there's some notable trends that we see across almost all marine mammals. First and foremost, the importance of vision appears to be reduced. In other words, vision doesn't normally seem to be as important as it would be to a terrestrial mammal. Also, detecting touch is still very important, especially something called pressure waves in the water. Pressure waves are made by things like fish that are swimming ahead of you, and they leave these pressure footprints in the water that possibly can be detected by certain marine mammals. The importance of smell is reduced in most, although not all cases, which of course makes sense because why would you need it if you're swimming in the water? Things don't normally have a basic smell to them. And finally, perceiving sound is greatly enhanced. So the importance of sound becomes very important for almost all marine mammals. In fact, it's so important that it's actually going to comprise its own set of 3 lectures. So what we're going to do is we're going to save sound for the next 3 lectures after this and instead focus on what I will call the others, which is vision, touch, and smell. So let's start with vision. In order to understand the importance of how vision has changed, we have to first look at how light penetrates into the ocean floor in essentially the water. And of course, as you may already know from your own experience with the ocean or water, light doesn't penetrate water the same way that it penetrates air. So if you have a light wave that's coming through the air, it's going to expand a very, very long distance. Unfortunately, in water, light tends to be absorbed very quickly, which means that the light gets very dim very quickly. And so if you go down about 40 or 50 meters into the ocean, you're going to see that it's quite dim or dark, in some cases even black, because light simply doesn't penetrate water very, very well. Moreover, the colors change. In other words, different wavelengths penetrate differently. Reds and oranges are the first to go, and blues and greens last a lot longer. You drop a red M&M from the top of the ocean down into the ocean, it's going to disappear very quickly. You drop a blue M&M, you're going to be able to see it for a lot longer. And then finally, the other thing that will influence light penetration is going to be something called turbidity. Turbidity is basically the idea of how many particles there are in the water. When you have something called a plankton bloom, lots of debris and small organisms in the water, it makes it very cloudy looking and light doesn't penetrate very far. I've actually swam in the ocean before, where when I swim, when I put one arm in front of me, I can't even see my hand in front of me anymore. The water was so turbid. Areas that have a lot of great snorkeling, like the tropics, Hawaii, that type of environment, tends to have a low turbidity, which usually means there's not a lot of organisms, small organisms in the water column. So that's something else to think about as well when we think about how vision is affected. So how is vision affected? Well, when we take a look at cetaceans, and we'll look at them first, you might notice already, or you might have already noticed, that cetacean eyes tend to be really small. If you think about an orca, a dolphin, and in this case we have a beluga here, the eyes are much smaller than what we would expect in a mammal of that size, suggesting that vision is not that important. Small eyes mean you're not putting a lot of emphasis on your ability to see. Moreover, they have other anatomical adaptations that help them see in turbid waters, dim waters, or in some cases, deep waters. And so that includes a lot of adaptations that are very similar to what seems to be like night vision. So we, as humans, have a special night vision that allows us to see in dim light, and they basically take that and exaggerate it. So they do that at the expense of what you might consider to be more like day vision. In addition, because reds and yellows don't penetrate very far in the water column, they don't use a lot of senses for those colors, instead focusing on the blues and the greens. And finally, some cetaceans are blind or almost blind. This is particularly true for cetaceans that live in almost entirely murky waters, which include the river dolphins. So some river dolphins are actually called blind river dolphins because they have lost their vision so completely simply because the water is just too cloudy most of the time for them to see anything, so why retain it? Pinnipeds show kind of a different strategy. Pinnipeds, because they are spending some of their time on land and not all of their time on water, have retained large eyes. In fact, they have larger than would be expected eyes. And they also have several anatomical adaptations that help them permit vision in both the air and the water. These are a little too complicated for the scope of this lecture, but suffice it to say that our eyes, human eyes, are adapted for air. When we get into water, we don't see very clearly unless we have goggles on. Pinnipeds can actually change the shape of their eye a little bit so that it allows them to see clearly on both land and in the water. And just like cetaceans, we see that they tend to focus also on the blues and the greens rather than the reds and the yellows, which don't penetrate very far in the water either. So what about a sense of touch? Well, it turns out that you might not think that touch is very important in marine mammals. For pinnipeds, tactile sensitivity, which is sensitivity to touch, is actually very important. And this is enhanced by the presence of these stiff whiskers called vibrissae. And these are connected to nerve endings. What they do is when you move a vibrissae, it ends up actually sensing or sending a signal to the brain that this whisker has moved. The sensitivity is a whole lot like having a splinter embedded in your finger and then moving that splinter around. Even slight movements are definitely detected, and so slight movements in the water are actually picked up by these vibrissae, and they are extraordinarily pronounced in pinnipeds. So what's the point of these specialized whiskers? Most likely the point is going to be to look for fish, which are their prey items. As we mentioned earlier, fish tend to leave what's called pressure waves or pressure tracks in the water column, and these pressures can actually deflect the vibrissae in such a way that the pinnipeds might actually be able to detect, hey, there's a fish over there. So if a fish is swimming over here on your right, it's actually going to send a series of waves that end up depressing the vibrissae on the right-hand side of the face, and it will say, hey, there's a fish over there, why don't we go over and try to eat it? It turns out that some of the mysticetes retain a very small number of them around their chin, which is also used possibly for prey detection. Now remember, the baleen whales are not looking for big fish, they're looking for small plankton, but it could help them detect big densities of plankton, whereas the odontocetes seem to have lost their hair altogether, and they tend to rely exclusively on a different sense called echolocation for sensing prey, and therefore they're not looking for necessarily pressure tracks in the water column, and they therefore have lost their hair, including the vibrissae. And finally, sense of smell. In most cases, the sense of smell has been lost. Pinnipeds have retained some sense of smell, which may be important on land, let's say for a mother and a pup to smell each other and bond. Odontocetes have lost it completely. They don't seem to retain any semblance of their olfactory senses or their sense of smell, which makes sense. They're in the water. Things don't really smell in the water. There isn't anything they need to smell. But interestingly enough, the mysticetes have actually retained a marginal sense of smell, which of course brings up the question, why? Why would mysticetes have a marginal sense of smell? And whalers have often noticed that when big swarms of plankton get together, they actually have an odor to them or a discernible smell. It's possible that when the whale surfaces, they actually smell the area around them to determine if they're in a very plankton-rich area or whether they need to move to another area to try to feed. So we do see some sense of retention there, and it's just postulated that maybe it's to smell swarms of plankton, although that's certainly not proven. And with that, I will see you next time.